guys, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we are testing out the new NATASHA DENONA Bloom palette. We're going to take a look at this one. We'll be looking at some swatches. We're going to be doing this eye look today, which is very pretty. But then at the end of the video, I'm going to show you guys some comparisons and talk about some eyeshadow palettes that I think might have some overlap with this one, including some palettes from NATASHA DENONA herself, which hopefully will give you an idea of whether this is one you should pick up or whether you should skip it over altogether. I do have some thoughts on this one, so we will get into that throughout this video. Hopefully that sounds like fun to you guys. Before we do that though, if you are a new visitor here, welcome to my channel. Please consider subscribing and make sure your notifications are turned on. And with that said, let's just jump right into it. All right, here is the palette. It is a beautiful one. The packaging is really beautiful. I love with some of her newer palettes, and maybe it's because she's releasing them more often than she used to, that they're getting a little bit more decorative. I do appreciate that when you're paying $69 for a palette. It's nice to have one that doesn't just look kind of like, I mean, I like these too, but this is a little fancier and funner. So let's have a look inside. This is what it looks like. Very pretty. Sadly, I have already used this for a couple of days. I actually filmed this video a few days ago, had some technical trouble with it, so we're refilming it today. So I have used this palette for, this will be my 4th day in a row using it. We'll get into a couple things about that. So I feel like I've kind of gotten a better feel for this one. Haven't used everything yet, but I have used probably about maybe not quite half of the shades in here. I'm gonna go ahead and insert for you guys right here the close-up of the palette along with these swatches so you can see how the shades compare to one another. I did want to read to you guys the description of this palette and of some of the formulas on her website. I think that can be a little bit helpful if you are familiar with NATASHA DENONA's eyeshadow palettes. So for this one, it says, capturing the essence of blooming flowers and the radiance of sunny days, NATASHA introduces the Bloom eyeshadow palette. This ultimate essential debuts 15 brand new warm-toned floral hues, peachy corals, rich burgundies, and complementing mauves in her unmatched standard setting formulas. Now, NATASHA DENONA does have a lot of different formulas that she has experimented with and tried in various palettes, especially over the last 2 years, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the formulas that are in this palette here. I don't believe any of these formulas are brand new, but there are a lot of different formulas in here. So I'm going to insert the close-up for you guys again right here, and we'll go over some of the formulas, and then I'll star which shades are which formula for you and kind of describe what they are. So first off is her metallic formula. This one is just her standard shimmer formula. So these are the shades that are in the metallic formula. She also includes her creamy matte, or just her standard matte formula. The CM designation is for her standard matte formula. She also includes a silky matte formula. This one I actually am not that familiar with. There are also a couple duochromes in here, and then a couple of her sparkling foiled formulas in here as well. That's her shimmer formula that's a little bit more sheer, kind of a glitter topper, a micro glitter topper formula. I love this formula. I think it's very beautiful. It doesn't always come across as impressive in swatches as it does in person. You have to really like see it in person to see that microfine glitter detail. So those are the formulas inside the palette. As I mentioned, I have tried this. This will be my, I think my 4th day in a row trying out this palette. And there is something that I noticed with this one is that it tends to make my eyes water more than usual. I didn't initially think that it was the palette. I thought it might just be allergies or something, but as I've used it now for 3 days, I noticed each day by mid-afternoon, my eyes just seemed to be continually watering. It wasn't so bad to the point where I felt like things were swelling up or I needed to wash anything off, but clearly there's something inside here that tends to irritate my eyes just a little bit more than what I'm used to. So maybe be aware of that if you have very sensitive eyes. I was kind of surprised by that because I don't think I've noticed that in a specific palette before. So we're gonna do a look with this palette today, and then towards the end of the video we're going to walk through some other palettes within my collection that I feel like might have some overlap with this one right here. I have a couple drugstore options, and then also I'm going to compare this to a couple of her other palettes that I thought might be similar to this one and actually were not, and then a few that I was surprised had quite a bit of overlap with this one. So we'll go through those at the end of the video. So with that, I'm gonna zoom you guys in. We'll get started with testing this thing out. All right, so for this look today, we're gonna use my Sydney Grace brushes along with this one, which is the Sigma E25. I wanna start off in this shade up here. Actually, let's do a combination of these two. These are like the lightest matte shades in here. This one is quite light. I used this one yesterday, found it to be just a little bit too light to show up on my light medium skin tone, but we're gonna combine these two together. They're very light, but they have quite a bit of like punch to them. I kind of apply those slightly above my crease to get started, and then we're gonna kind of build up some depth as we move down and into that socket. With that same brush, we're gonna go to this shade down in the bottom. This is the shade Robin. If you do like warmer pinks, this is a fun color story for spring. I think like for Easter time, spring. I'm wondering if this shade that I'm using right now, which is one of my favorites from the palette that I've used so far, because I think I've used this shade every day since I've gotten this palette, and maybe this is the shade that's giving my eyes some trouble. Because other than this one, I think I varied things a little bit more. Okay, we're gonna take a smaller brush with that same shade right there. We're gonna run that lightly under the outer half of the lower lash line. Like if you look at a look like this is why I think this kind of color can be intimidating when you're working with warmer pinks. They can start to look, especially as you're applying them. I mean, once the look's all completed, you have some liner and mascara on, everything's kind of done and polished. There is a moment where they get to looking like maybe you have allergies, like maybe you've been rubbing your eyes really hard. Almost have that kind of my eyes are irritated color to them. So if this type of a color story is not done right, it can make you look a little bit sickly, I guess is what I'm saying. Now we're gonna dip into this shade right here. I love this shade. This is the shade Floss, F-L-O-S. The smaller blending brush, this one we're gonna start building up along the lash line and up lightly into the crease. I can already tell my eyes are starting to water a little bit. It's very unfortunate because I do like this color story. It's kind of forced me to come out of my neutral shell, which I haven't done for quite a bit. Maybe I need to start doing it more because it is very pretty. All right, and now we're going to dip into this shade down here. This is the shade Clover. It's a beautiful kind of like burgundy. This one we're gonna go right at the lash line and just slowly feather up into this outer corner. Concentrating most of it right down at the lash line though. This is the E25 brush from Sigma. All right, and now let's add some shimmer to the lid. So let's start off with, let's go with this shade right here. This is the shade Fluorescence. This is a metallic shade. And then for the inner corner, we're gonna dip into this shade in the corner right here. This is the shade Floor. This one is a duochrome. It's a very subtle duochrome. It's kind of a light pink with a slightly warm, subtle gold shift to it. Okay, and then just for fun, let's go on top of the center of the lid with one of these sparkling foiled shades. So we have Crisp and then Lush are two of her sparkling foiled shades. So we've got, see, this one is a little darker, a little more golden. Ooh, they're both pretty. Let's go with this one, the lighter one, Crisp. I'm just gonna tap that right on top, all the way across the center of the lid. It's pretty sure it just adds a little bit more dimension to it. Let's add a little bit of liner. I'm gonna take just a little baby wing with my Wet n Wild Simma Brown now. Actually, let's do this. We're gonna do a baby wing with this, and then I also want to go on top of that with that dark brown in here. For that, I actually wanna use my Persona liner brush. I'm just gonna dip into this dark brown right here. This shade I have not used yet, so I'm curious how dark this one will be. Okay, it's pretty dark. Very pretty. All right, now I'm gonna add a couple coats of mascara. We'll take my Maybelline Sky High today. Then I'll zoom you guys back out. We'll take a look at the finished look, and then we'll go through some palette comparisons. All right, and here is the finished eye look. What do you guys think? I think it's very pretty, very, very beautiful. Now, I wanna now go through some other palettes that this palette reminds me of. I wouldn't say they're dupes for them. We're not really gonna do a side-by-side dupe of anything, but there's some palettes that have some overlap with this one. First off, a couple of palettes I thought of as I've been using this over the last couple of days that I have actually decluttered over the last several years. I decluttered a lot of palettes that I really like because I have so many. One of those was the Juvia's Place Nubian 3 Coral palette. Now that palette has a row of grays, but other than those gray tones, the shades in the top 2 rows of that palette, which I hope is still available, but even if it's not, some of you may still own that one. This palette does remind me a little bit of that color story. So if you have that, you may not need this one. Another one that I thought of that I don't actually own anymore is from ColourPop. It's the ColourPop Coral palette. I think it's called the Coral palette. If they still make that one, which they might not, that one's quite old. Very pretty color story, more of like a bold coral color story, almost orangey in tone. That one kind of reminded me of this palette. A couple drugstore palettes that I do own currently that remind me just a little bit of this one or have a little bit of overlap are, first off, the ColourPop Blush Crush palette. This is one of my favorites from ColourPop. It is I would say this one's a little bit more muted. It doesn't quite have the vibrancy as this one does. Clearly there are more shades inside here, but I bet there's a lot of overlap with some of these shades. I've actually finger swatched a few of these side by side, like this pink that we used on my inner corner today reminds me quite a bit of the shade right here down below. They're almost identical to one another, very, very close. Even this kind of golden pink up here reminds me of the glitter topper that we used today. I've kind of got my fingers all mixed up. Let's go, hold on, let me wipe this one off. Wipe that finger off. Let's try this one right here. So there they are. Not exact, but there's definitely some overlap. These would look quite similar to each other on the eyes. Even some of the mattes in this palette reminded me of the mattes inside here. Let's have a look at this one here at the bottom that we used on the outer corner next to this shade in the corner of the Blush Crush palette, which does have some glitter in it, but again, quite similar to one another. Last up, let's try this center shade. Kind of this pinky peach, I think I said that wrong. And then this shade up at the top right here, the shade Wren. These are somewhat similar to each other. There they are. So yes, you get some variety with this one. You do get some of these like red tones that you don't get in the ColourPop palette, but if you have that ColourPop one, if you're looking to save some money and you want to not be tempted, that definitely is going to give you some similar looks to this palette. Another one I thought of that's very affordable. This one is very small, so clearly not a dupe, but similar feel vibe to it is the Coral Me Maybe palette from Essence. So I just wanted to swatch like the brown here with the brown inside here. Not exact, but similar. Let's have a look at this kind of peachy color here and see how it compares to the one that we used on the outer half of the lid, this fluorescence shade. These actually are maybe one of the closest dupes that I found yet. Those are like exactly the same. So yeah, very surprising. And even this matte right here, let's compare that to Robin. That's the shade, the second shade that we used today. So here's Robin. Let's see how that compares to this shade down at the bottom here. There we go. Very, very close. I know I haven't done swatches. That probably would have been helpful. I'll try and do that from now on. So not exact, but somewhat similar. So for those of you that are on a budget, maybe are tempted by this one, if you happen to own some of those other options, you definitely can get some similar looks from those. Now let's have a look at some of Natasha Denona's other palettes. Initially, I thought this palette looked quite unique. I hadn't seen a strictly warm, kind of corally toned palette from her before, but as I was digging into my collection, there were more palettes that reminded me of this one than I thought. Now the first two palettes that I thought of, or that I thought might have some overlap with this one, actually didn't at all. I first thought of the I Need a Warm palette, and once I looked at them side by side, I mean, they're not really close. They're not even close at all. In fact, let me turn my lights down just a little bit. There we go. Hopefully this will help a little bit. So here are these two color stories side by side. I always thought this palette leaned a little bit peach, but clearly it's not quite this peach. So nothing there. I also thought of maybe the Retro palette, which is her berry toned palette, but again, there might be one or two, maybe, but not quite. But there were two that I found that I did not initially think of to have quite a bit of overlap. The first one is the My Dream palette. I love this palette, kind of underrated in my opinion. This one clearly has a lot more variety. It's not as monochromatic. You get some basics in here, you get some neutrals in here, which you don't get in the Bloom palette. But if you look at some of these peachy colors, the red in here, this kind of fiery orange, they look a little bit similar. And actually, as I've been using this palette, and when I think of the looks I do when I typically reach for this palette, are some of those like the fiery orange or some of these kind of champagne golds or the peachy tones in here, which give me similar looks. Now clearly you get a black in here, you get some neutrals, get some cooler tones, but other than like those four shades, the other shades do have a bit of crossover. So I want to do just a couple side by sides. Let's start off with this red tone right here. This is shade Ember. It's a beautiful color. This one reminds me quite a bit of the shade Risk inside here. Let's give those a swatch on the back of my hand. Now, obviously, this one is quite a bit warmer. This is the shade from the Bloom palette, the shade Ember. So the one from the My Dream palette has a bit more coolness to it. It's a little bit more purpley, but somewhat similar to one another. I also wanted to compare this shade right here. It's the shade Lush with this shade Invention, which is kind of like a fiery orange duochrome. Now this one has more orange to it. So here we have, this is the one from the Bloom palette. Here's the one from the My Dream, which is quite a bit more orange, but somewhat similar. Actually, I think there might be another that reminds me of that shade. Let's have a look at this one. This is the shade Thrill. Maybe this is the one I was thinking of. So Thrill and what was it again? Lush. Those ones have some definite overlap. Now they're not probably coming across too much on camera, but definitely very similar to one another. I also wanted to compare Unity. This is the center shade in the My Dream palette. Let's see, so here's Unity. Kind of a good basic peachy tone. And I want to compare that to Robin. Actually, no, these are quite similar. Okay, those are almost identical. And then last, I want to compare this shade. Now this is a creamy, one of her creamy or cream to powder formulas. This is the shade Edgy from the My Dream palette. And let's see how this compares to that darker shade we used in my outer corner. As far as the color goes, that's this shade Clover right here. Not exact, but definitely some similarities there. Okay, so not exact. I know none of those are gonna be perfect dupes, but they're gonna give you a similar type of look on your eyes if you're really looking to save some money or looking to see if this is something you really need. Now, the last one I wanna take a look at might be the one that has the most overlap. And it's an older palette from NATASHA Denona. I don't even know if she still sells this one. I think I might have seen it recently either on the NATASHA Denona website or on the Beautylish website. I will link it if I can find it down below. It is the Sunset palette. This is an old favorite of mine. Now, if you take out the these three bright yellows, other than that, there's quite a few similar shades in here. And one in particular that I was kind of surprised by, these actually remind me a lot of one another, and that's this shade in the corner, which is a kind of duochrome pink with a blue shift to it. Not a shade that I reach for super often, but it's very pretty. And there is a shade similar in the Sunrise. Did I say Sunset? I meant Sunrise. It's the Sunrise palette. This shade right here, which is called Aster. So let's see how those two shades compare. Okay, these actually aren't maybe as close as I was thinking they might be. All right, so this one is from the Bloom palette. This is called Equinox. This one's a lot more blue. This one from Aster. Okay, they're not even close to each other. They look similar in the pan. They actually don't swatch very similar to each other at all. Okay, so I take that back. Maybe that one's not a dupe, but let's have a look at a couple others. Let's try this shade right here. This is shade Rue, like a medium toned berry red, raspberry shade sort of. There it is right there. And I want to see how that one compares to this one in the top, the shade Poppy. So this is Poppy, a little bit darker, but somewhat similar. And now let's compare the shade Ember right here. And let's see how that compares to this shade in the top center, the shade Phlox, this red. Okay, this one's a lot more red. But once you kind of blend those out, there's definitely some similarities there. I wanted to see how Clover down here compares to the shade Clove inside the Sunrise palette. So there's Clover. I do love the shade Clove. This is Clove. Yeah, these I think are gonna be very close. Very close. Okay, those look like the same shade. This one might have a little bit more purple. This one might be a little bit more brown, but I mean, we're really splitting hairs on that one. That one's pretty close. Okay, let's try it. Let's try a couple shimmers. We're gonna try this shade Floor, which is the one we used on my inner corner. So here's the shade Floor. Sorry, I know my arm's really stained right now. And let's compare that to this shade Laurel in this top corner. It's very, very close. Those are close. You can see Floor just has a tiny bit more pink in it. Maybe you can see my arm is so dirty. Let's try one more. Let's go with the shade Lush. That was the warmer glitter topper that I considered putting on my eyes. So here's the shade Lush. And let's see how that compares to Agate right here. Here we have Agate. A little bit lighter, but very similar. All right, so if you happen to still own the Sunrise palette and maybe you're very tempted by the Bloom palette, but you don't have it in the budget, you might want to reconsider or go and pull your Sunrise palette out. This is a palette that I forget about because it's such a bold color story. It's one of those palettes that I start to think about as like spring and summer rolls around. But there are a lot of those corally pinks and berry tones in that palette that definitely have some crossover with the Bloom palette. So hopefully you guys found that little demonstration helpful. At the end of the day, I could definitely talk you in or out of this one depending on kind of what you're looking for or what your budget is. Those are really the two biggest things. So if you want me to talk you into it, I would say this palette is for those that have some money to spend and love their coral or warm toned pinks. But I don't think this is the most unique palette ever. I really feel like we've gotten to this, I know I've said this several times before, but we've really gotten to this place in makeup. We've been doing this long enough, buying makeup long enough, or collecting makeup long enough that nothing nowadays is truly unique. So if you don't have it in the budget, just don't do it. I'm sure that there are things within your collection that you can use that are gonna give you very similar looks. Even I, after trying this one out, I love the look that this created, but I almost guarantee I create something imperceptibly different to the eye with several of these palettes I've mentioned today, including the drugstore ones. So let that be my final word on this one, I guess. I imagine this is probably not gonna end up being my very favorite of her palettes because of the watery eye issue and also just the boldness of it. As pretty as I think it is, it's just not really something I likely will use every day. But I hope that you guys found this video helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear if you guys are interested in this one. What palettes do you own in your collection that you think might be similar to this one? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't yet done that, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.